Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 3. Congratulations for making it halfway through the class. That's quite an accomplishment. I know that this is a lot of work and it moves quickly. And so congrats to all of you who are sticking in. We've lost a few along the way. And that's always to be expected in this class. And I would say if you're struggling with it, you do still have time to drop with a W. Not that I'm necessarily encouraging anyone in specific, but know that is an option. At a certain point after that, then you have to get a letter grade. I do know that some of you are putting more work into this than others. And as I mentioned in the announcement on Sunday, it's worth the time. It's worth taking the time to do this right. You'd be amazed at how many of these things will come back. I think one of the things I love about this class is that a lot of what we learn through the music, through the songs, through the artists, through the history, still applies today. A perfect example being the civil rights movement in the late 60s and how that applies. And then we're going to talk as we get closer in time to like the hippie movement and the psychedelic era. And so you're going to see lots of holdovers, lots of carryovers. And so it's worth digging in, doing the work. Again, just a reminder that if you're going for the least common denominator in terms of passing, i.e. you're trying to check off the subjects and hit the minimum word count, you'll get a C, and then you're banking on everything. So some of you are doing just like fabulous work, really, really impressive, solid stuff. And so it's worth the time. You can get a sense of that if you're reading other people's posts in the discussions. It's always good to kind of keep tabs. How are other folks doing versus how am I doing? And you get a sense of that. And then rise to the occasion. Don't go for the low bar, go for the high bar. So this week we are coming into week 3, another 5 modules, another test. Also, your concert report is due on Friday. That's to give me a little extra time to grade it and to also not be in the way hanging over the weekend. So that's due by the end of the day on Friday. I don't accept late work. Plan ahead. So you've got the time this week, or you can make the time. Make sure that you plan ahead so that you're not trying to get something submitted at 11:58 or 11:59, because of course, it's always when like the power goes out or something happens or someone gets sick or you fall asleep or the computer crashes. Those are those things that happen. So, do the work, get that in, really put the effort in to think about it. I've had people reach out to me about if certain concerts counted. One thing I would just kind of warn against with some of the older concerts is you're supposed to be writing about, the lights and the costumes, if there are any, and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of those old concerts back in the 50s, early 60s, even into the late 60s, they're pretty boring by today's standards, so it might not give you as much material to write about. So this week, moving forward, we actually saw at the end of last week, we saw the culmination of rock and roll. We saw that move into teen idol pop, into surf music, into the Beach Boys, into the British invasion. And then out of that, now what we start to see is rock music really splitting into these specific tangents. And they overlap a little bit. And again, we've spent a lot of time in the 60s. And now we're going to start to be jumping back before and forth between 60s and 70s. Maybe a little bit we start touching on the 80s, but a lot of it's there. So what you're going to learn about this week are different genres. So last week you learned about and wrapped up with folk rock. So folk rock and folk music and singer-songwriters. Folk rock is basically where you combine certain aspects of rock music and certain aspects of folk music. In the case of folk rock, you've got the instrumentation of rock music, electric guitars and drums in particular, but you've got a lot of the subject matter, the weightiness, the heaviness, the storytelling that you would find in folk music as well as the great poetry. So we're going to continue down this path and understand again Nothing exists in a vacuum. These are all happening a lot at the same time. So keep in mind when we talked about like soul and Motown and the Beach Boys and the British invasion and folk rock and Bob Dylan, it's all at the same time. It's an amazing, amazing time. So the Beach Boys, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Temptations, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Otis Redding, Aretha Franklin, the Beatles, the Stones, the Kinks, the Who, Bob Dylan, the Turtles, Simon and Garfunkel, the Mamas and the Papas, all at the same time. And that's going to continue on. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin. You've started to learn about them, and we'll learn about them more. There are a couple of artists that will show up in different chapters. There's just a few that their impact is so important that they will actually show up in different ones. So one of them is Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan in folk rock. And then when we get to the chapter on country rock, Bob Dylan is one of the folks that actually started that one. Particularly with his album Nashville Skyline. You're going to learn about Graham Parsons and those folks. We learned a bit about Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin with the Blues Revival, and they come back in Psychedelic Rock chapter, so they are important. They cross over. And then one that we'll get to, not this time, but in the last week, is James Brown, because James Brown was important as an R&B artist, and then also becomes important because he was really the guy that started funk. So some artists cross over and have importance in other ways. So you'll see a little bit of repetition, not a ton, but you'll see a little bit of repetition. So this week you're going to learn about psychedelic rock. And I want you really to pay attention in the module. On that first page, when you get in there, I give you a bunch of dates that are important to understand as we get into the psychedelic era. And that really has plays a heavy role and plays an important role in popular music, at least for a little while. And so when you start to think about existentialist thought, people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Camus, writers like that, you think about the rise in awareness of Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism, and so you'll start to see that, and some little bit Hinduism. You will see very much the impact of drugs, particularly hallucinogenic drugs. And basically what you have happening during this time is you have a lot of people young people that are disenchanted with the world. They're seeing what's going on in the world. They're seeing the Vietnam War. They're seeing their friends getting drafted and not coming back. They're seeing the civil rights movement. They're seeing all these things that are happening, and they're very disenchanted with the world. And so they sort of view the world and look at it and go, okay, well, this is what, the American dream gone wrong to them. And if the West represents everything wrong, then maybe there's wisdom to get in the East and wisdom to get from somewhere else. So there's a lot of searching. There's a lot of people that are lost, that are struggling, that are hopeless. And so they're seeking things out, to try to find answers. I mean, I think that's part of the human condition, right? We're always looking for answers. We're trying to understand, why is the world the way that it is? Why are people the way that they are? The crazy thing is you learn about what's going on during that time and what's going on now, and not a lot has changed in the last 50 years. Another important factor is birth control. So what happens with the popularity, the sort of when the pill gets put on the market and becomes very, very popular, it changes the role of reproduction, right? So up until this time, the primary person responsible for birth control was the man. And by the time the pill comes along, now it changes the game because the woman is having control. And so it changes the power structure. It changes the dynamic, for good and for bad. And so nothing comes out clean, right? I mean, I think we can see that even today in the world. It's so easy to want to generalize and say, well, this is definitely a better thing now. And there's always pluses and minuses. To quote, Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And so we'll see that a lot in here, and we'll see a lot of tragedy. We'll see not only the tragedies of the assassinations and the tragedies of the Vietnam War, but we'll see the tragedies of the impact of drugs, and we'll see the tragedies of a generation that kind of gets lost. And so I want you to be thinking about that. Be mindful as you're working through this time about what happens here. So that's just one genre. You're going to learn about country rock and jazz rock. So as I mentioned before, we have, we've seen rhythm and blues becoming rock and roll becoming rock. And now what's going to happen is that you're going to have genres that merge and combine and create things new. We already saw that with folk rock. So with country rock, right? Combinations of country and rock and roll. And really what that means is largely is rock artists that are picking up country. So people like the Byrds, eventually Graham Parsons, Flying Burrito Brothers, and that eventually leads us to Linda Ronstadt, which leads us to the Eagles, Leonard Skinner, Southern rock, the Allman Brothers. You're going to learn about that. And then jazz rock, where you have artists, musicians that are trained in jazz, and but they also are loving the energy that they're hearing from rock and roll. They're loving what they're hearing from the Beatles and the Stones and these other groups, and so they find ways to combine. And you get Blood, Sweat and Tears and Steely Dan and Chicago. These folks that are bringing it in. And then on the other side, there's a module on fusion. Fusion is where you have jazz artists that are influenced by rock. Maybe they have, instead of swinging drum beats, they have straight drum beats. Instead of a stand-up acoustic bass, they have electric bass. And you get, of course, Miles Davis is one of the kings of that. And then you get Weather Report and Herbie and the Headhunters and all of that's coming in, that's bringing those things in. You're going to learn about hard rock and heavy metal. So there are bands that take what they've learned with rock and roll, and through using distortion and other things, they take it even farther. I want you to be mindful, thinking about hard rock and heavy metal. And are they different? And they are. Think about why. What makes them different? And understand that there's always gray areas, right? So there's certain things that you can find that will cross over. But the foundation really out of for hard rock is Link Wray leading into really the Kinks. And You Really Got Me. That you have a song that is using distortion. At that time, it was made by slitting the cones of the speakers, amp speakers. Later, it would be pedals. Hendrix used pedals. It was also that it was based on a riff, not a chord progression. You get these power chords, which aren't really chords. A chord, by definition, has 3 or more pitches in it, and a power chord only has 2. But you have this foundation that the Kinks set with You Really Got Me, that leads us down a path, and you get into other bands, but really the band that is the important band that really coalesces and moves these genres forward is Led Zeppelin. So Led Zeppelin really you can find the roots of both hard rock and heavy metal in them. And so I want you to be thinking about that as you're listening to the music. What makes these styles different? How does Led Zeppelin exemplify that? Led Zeppelin, definitely one of the great rock bands of all time. Understand that a couple things about them. One, they had some ethics issues. They were kind of known for taking songs by other people and passing them off as their own. A real quick, easy example is Dazed and Confused, but there are others, and the book will talk about it a little bit. But the other thing with Led Zeppelin, you got to understand, when you have bands like the Beatles and the Stones and the Kinks and the Who, what you have is groups of young musicians that become friends, that form bands. They typically start off as cover bands, and then they start writing material, and then they become popular. Led Zeppelin was really a super group. These 4 musicians already had careers started and were already known and respected in their fields. And when they came together, you had a powerhouse of a band. Like, you're taking 4 of the best out there and bringing them together. So these aren't like 4 guys that went to school together that started playing. Jimmy Page was playing professionally, as you learned about before, with Skiffle. And then became a studio musician, as did John Paul Jones. John Bonham and Robert Plant were also out there working as musicians before they came together. So that's why they're just such an important and amazing band. And you're going to learn about progressive and glitter rock, progressive rock, sometimes referred to as glam rock or art rock. And basically there what you have is bands that are maybe you have musicians. So we talk about jazz rock, musicians that are trained in jazz that start blending it with rock. In progressive rock or art rock, you have musicians, often classically trained musicians, that are wanting to up the level of musicianship, and that could be by using orchestral instruments more orchestrally than just like, say, you would get strings in Stand By Me or something. You would also get where they're influenced by the forms of classical music. So instead of the rock and roll A, B kind of forms, which there's really a few forms, they want to make more sophisticated arrangements. And then you have artists that are really kind of want to push the boundaries and are influenced by what we would call avant-garde trends. Avant-garde is a French term. Originally, it's a military term. It means the advanced guard. And what you have, though, in the arts, not just music, but visual arts and all of them, is the avant-garde is those people that are out there pushing the envelope, trying to take things in new directions. Sometimes you hear the term cutting edge, or nowadays you'll even hear the term bleeding edge. But they're the ones that are really experimental. And so that's where you get folks like Pink Floyd, who are incorporating musique concrète and using all sorts of non-musical sounds in musical ways. And they're influenced by Edgar Varese, who you'll hear. And it's always a fun one when I have students listen to Poème électronique, because, I get a lot of students all the time. They'll say, I like all music. I really do. And I'll say, oh, do you then? And most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, they're coming from a pretty narrow frame of mind. They haven't heard Korean opera, and they haven't heard Poème électronique or music by Schoenberg and Webern and things like that. So it's always taken then within a context of what they know. Maybe in pop music, when you say, oh, I like all kinds of music, maybe you mean in the pop world, you like all kinds of music. So I like country, and I like hip hop, and I like, whatever, metal and punk, and that's fine. But then there's all these other things out there. So this week I want you to just listen to Poème électronique, at least listen to the first minute or two of it, because it's a different way of organizing sounds. And you might even listen to it and say, I don't think this is music. And that's valid. That could be okay, as long as you could back it up in terms of, well, what makes something a piece of music versus just sounds. And then we're going to learn something to complete change out of all of that world, is you're going to learn about ska and reggae. And ska and reggae is styles of music that came out of Jamaica. And they were very much influenced by the music that they were not only hearing around them from the islands, the Caribbean music, African music, because if you look at Jamaica, it was largely populated by slaves through the slave trade. And we talked about that at the beginning of the class, but we can see the impact of that again. And so you have African influences and Latin influences, because the slave trade, like I said, went from West Africa to Brazil and up. So all these, things come along with it. They have their own style of music. And then they're also, because of the way that radio is transmitted, they are hearing music from the United States. They're hearing rhythm and blues. They're hearing soul. And it's influencing the music they make, but combined with mento and other styles in Jamaica, it's creating its own thing. So you have, this music develop in Jamaica. Ska came first. Then you kind of moved through rocksteady into reggae. And then you can see the influences of ska and reggae later in the 70s with two-tone and the second wave, and then the third wave of ska later. We don't get into that in here, but that's where you're talking about bands like Real Big Fish and No Doubt and folks like that. So we don't get that far up. So you're going to learn about that. One other thing that I do want to point out is that we talked about radio. If you remember, going back to the beginning, and I said, okay, we're always talking about radio as AM radio. And it is around this time in the late 60s that FM radio comes in and becomes a huge game changer, because artists that could never get played on AM top 40 pop radio, people like Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and all of that, could get played on FM radio. Same with some of the jam bands like the Grateful Dead or San Francisco bands like Jefferson Airplane. They weren't going to get played necessarily on AM, but they got played on FM radio, and then FM radio became a big thing and really took over and changed for a long time the game of radio. So now we're at the time where we can get there. So I think that gives you a good overview. Take the time to go through the materials. Take the time to understand what you're learning. Don't just click through the modules to try to get there. I mean, ultimately, I can't control you. I actually reached out once to one of the guys that oversees this at the college, and I said, what are your thoughts on like making part of the grade the time spent or whatever? And he said, there's always a way to game the system. You can just leave it open and it'll put more time. So I know I'm like giving you that trick, and I don't really sit down and micromanage your time. It's that I care and I want you to learn. So that's why I do this. I'm not, some sort of like time police that's sitting down trying to figure out all that kind of stuff. I'm just sitting there thinking, okay, if you've put in 5 hours in this class so far, you're not learning anything. You're just trying to get through to get a grade, to get a degree. And like I mentioned in that last announcement, it's not about the degree, right? It's about what you learn and how you apply it in your life. And especially things like this apply. Without jazz and blues, we don't get rhythm and blues. Without rhythm and blues, we don't get to funk, we don't get to soul, we don't get to hip hop. And you think about the weight of all of that music. It's really, really important. So that's why I want you to do that. Okay, here's your question for the week. There's going to be 3 answers that you need to put down. One of them comes from the materials last week. 2 of them are going to be in the materials that you're going to learn this week. So, it's easy enough to look up, but you have to have all 3 parts, and it can only be in one post. Okay, so here's what you got to do. You've got to do, what year was the Newport Folk Festival that Bob Dylan went electric? What year was the Monterey Pop Festival that you learned about, that featured The Who and Janis Joplin and all of that you'll be learning about this week? And what year was Woodstock? Okay, pretty easy. I know you can hunt around and find them, but that's your question. You have to 1 reply, all 3 answers to get credit for this. Okay, I hope that's good. We're barreling through, so hang in there. Have a great week. Reach out if you have questions. I'll get back to you quick, and we'll talk more soon. Have a great week, guys. Bye.